the amount of work that piles up is just staggering.
Yeah. Did you go anywhere fun for vacation?
We just cruised around Montana, looked at some sites, and we went swimming and just did some stuff around the house. Yep.
Sounds like a good vacation.
I've never been to Montana, but I would like to be there.
Hey, you got a place to stay if you want to come over. I got a spare room or two.
Perfect. I got to get away from my son somehow.
All right, I think let me just do a few more housekeeping things, but I think we're ready to start. 1 minute past 1, so we're right on time. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining. My name is Erica Mixon. I am the content marketing manager here at Blumira. I'm joined today by Matt Warner, the CTO and co-founder of Blumira. Hey, Matt.
Hello.
As well as Pascal Ackerman, who is the managing director of threat services at ThreatGen. Pascal, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So today we're going to be talking about incident response for OT environments. I'm sure we all heard about Colonial Pipeline in the news, made national headlines. We're going to be kind of dissecting that event as well as talking about best practices, for having a comprehensive incident response plan. It's so important, and a lot of organizations struggle to come up with an incident response plan for a lot of reasons, and we'll delve into that today. So really excited to get started.
Yeah, good subject.
Absolutely. So Matt, can you tell us a little bit about your background and a brief overview as to what you do at Blumira?
Sure, yeah. I am Matt Warner. I'm the CTO and co-founder here at Blumira, as it says there. And my background is largely in defensive security, offensive security, kind of building the two together in regard to purple teaming, and kind of taking those solutions and meshing them with the development programmatic side of the world, which is where and how we came to the excitement of Blumira. Kind of how can we take defensive security and be a force multiplier for everyone across the environment.
Excellent. Yeah, we're really excited to talk about that today. And Pascal, do you mind giving us a brief intro? What do you do at ThreatGen?
So as the title says, I'm the managing director of threat services, which means that I get to manage a team of consultants, but I also get to go out with those guys and we implement what we call the full stack services solution, where we can basically help our customers protect every asset of their industrial environment. So as we probably go into detail, IT, I mean, OT is not a single entity anymore. Securing it often involves covering both the IT as well as the OT side of a business. And we have the know-how and we have the manpower to help with all of those implementations. So
Excellent.
Little background, I started off as an industrial controls engineer, and about 12 years ago, I changed my directions into the cybersecurity realm. Combine the two together and you get ICS security.
Excellent. So yeah, it seems like you have some hands-on experience in the OT space. That's great. What sort of customers do you have? Like what's your typical customer at ThreatGen?
The typical customers anywhere from manufacturing, food and beverage, all the way to oil and gas, and the electric grid. Typically, our customers come when they're thinking about starting a cybersecurity program that's ideally fitted for what we have to offer. So we help them do assessments, we help them get on the right track, we set up plans to implement a security improvement program. But we can also go in and do like threat hunting or breach assessments as a single entity, or just help them out set up a governance plan where they say, hey, we want a set of documents that tells us what we need to do and where to go. And then oftentimes that comes into more projects afterwards.
Excellent. That sounds like you're a really valuable resource to your customers. And ThreatGen has partnered up with Blumira. Tell me a little bit about how that came about and what sort of benefits that you've experienced since then.
So over the 20, 25 years of experience in the industry, I've seen, and I've actually been, I've implemented systems myself where a detection appliance like a firewall or an IDS will just spit out as many alerts as we can. And then it's up to the operator, the ICS owner to figure out what those alerts mean. And I've for a long time, we've been looking for a way to correlate and to aggregate these alerts. And at some point, I crossed paths with Blumera, and your solution is just easy to deploy. It's a centralized way of getting the events together and to generate alerts and do correlation. So we started looking at ways to integrate it too, and I'm happy to say that we found a way to get data out of a well-secured ICS environment into the cloud and have you do your correlation magic and kung fu on it, and give us alerts that we can act on.
Excellent. I'm so happy to hear that you found success with that. Great. Well, let's get into it. Next slide. The problem. So let's talk about the problem of ransomware, Matt. Ransomware obviously has been a huge headline these days in the news, but let's talk about, the impact of ransomware to organizations like OT organizations. Can you talk a little bit about that, Matt?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, ransomware has gone through a really interesting evolution over the last really 2 or 3 years at the most, where ransomware, when we're talking about 5 years ago, even further back than that, ransomware's been around for decades. One of the early attacks was kind of representational of ransomware, which is back in the 90s, where we see ransomware has gotten to a point where the attackers that are actually doing and performing these campaigns are using APT style techniques. They're moving into techniques where a lot of people in the IT and OT world, just across the world of enterprise and IT security, didn't really expect these campaigns to involve, like we'll use what happened a few weeks ago, like the Kaseya 0 day that came out. Historically, that would never really have happened. There wouldn't have been a ransomware group that was so put together that they would approach an attack in a campaign in the way that an APT would have, like, we want to do this targeted attack, we know we'll be successful, and here's how. And because of that, it puts everyone on the OT and IT side in a situation where we need to be more careful about how we're deploying and managing our attack surface. We need to just in general kind of evaluate where we are and what we're exposing to the environment, and how our employees and how our personnel are actually interacting with what's coming into and out of the environment. And of course, kind of ensuring that we have visibility across all of those layers and knowing if there's a breach, what are we going to do? If we have a detection, how are we going to approach it? And I know that Pascal and I have talked about this a lot, but of course, getting into defense in depth, determining really to ensure how can we make sure that we get ahead of that ransomware attack, or at least know when it's starting, instead of sitting all the way in the back and finding out when you're actually starting to encrypt files. So it's been a really, really interesting, in a bad way, last 2 years in regard to how ransomware has evolved. And a lot of it has been improving techniques, improving speed, improving methodology associated with forcing payouts. And it's been an interesting path that they've taken.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the most interesting things that I've learned about ransomware recently is the ransomware as a service, how that has really become a professional operation where, ransomware providers or ransomware threat actors are becoming basically companies where they have customer service departments that basically help you through, how to pay a ransom rather. And that's really scary to see them, sink money back into research and development and then get better at what they do. That's the most scary part from my perspective. Pascal, do you mind talking a little bit about, what your experience has been with, have any of your customers been, victims of ransomware attacks before ThreatGen was working with them?
Yep. So the biggest one that I can remember is back in 2016, I think, on the East Coast, I got called in on a major ransomware attack. It was the NotPetya. at the time, which was, it wasn't even a ransomware per se, because the ransom turned out to be a hoax. So even if you would pay it, they had no way of giving you a decryption key, because it was a randomly generated encryption key. So it was at the time called a data wiper, a wiper worm that basically took over your complete network, and that's what it did in with that company. They had, I think, 12 facilities completely wiped out by this, and we went in and we spent almost 18 hours a day for almost 2 weeks straight recovering from scratch, because backups were encrypted, their infrastructure was encrypted, and so on. So that was I'm going to say the old way of doing ransomware, where you went to a wrong website, you got infected, and it started spreading over the network. I'm going to say this lightly, but luckily that changes nowadays. You'll have some actor in your system that does exfiltration, like we're going to talk about Colonial, where they get the data out, and then as a last resort, they leave you with a little present called ransomware, and that's mainly, I think, to hide the evidence. So they'll wipe everything, so you can't recover, but you can also not recall or recreate what happened. That's in my opinion, that's a better way than having just a wiper in there, because now we have a chance to catch this. We have a chance with the right tools in place and with the right eyes on the right corners of your network. You can detect that initial infiltration before they deploy the ransomware. We have that short time, or a long time for some companies, to detect that they're actually in there and prevent them from being able to deploy the ransomware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. So I just launched a poll asking if you've been the victim of a ransomware attack. Looks like so far the majority of our attendees have said no, which is, no surprise to us. But someone did say that they were the victim of a ransomware attack. If you feel comfortable with it, just drop a line in the chat. You can just have it sent to the panelists, and we won't share your information or anything like that. But curious to hear your experience with that. What you learned from that. Always interesting to hear some on the ground responses with that. So with OT environments, we're seeing a lot of ransomware attacks with those companies. Pascal, do you mind talking a little bit to the challenges that OT environments specifically face and why?
Sure. So like the bullet points say, OT systems are difficult to patch, difficult to maintain, and difficult to keep up to date, just because, first of all, a lot of times there are just no patches because the support system is lagging or missing, because some of these systems can be out there for decades. I've been in plants where they ran the same PLC, a programmable logical controller, which is the brains of an automation system, has been running for 30, 40, 50 years sometimes. So it's hard to get patches. A lot of times operating systems have evolved from being some proprietary system from a vendor to Windows-based, but then they're stuck behind in the days of Windows XP and even Windows 7 nowadays, and to some degree Windows 10 systems are becoming obsolete. So those are still in there. In order to upgrade those, it's not just not feasible for money-wise, but also for the downtime on it. These systems are expected to be 101% uptime and available to run their stuff. So you just don't have the time, the resources to patch this stuff. Combine that with ransomware that takes advantage of systems that are not properly patched, and that's just a fantastic combination to cause a lot of mayhem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting because with OT, that can really bridge into physical security as well, like making sure that the environment itself is safe, that all of the equipment is working properly. Have you ever seen any situations where people were injured or anything like that?
Not personally, but there has been a few incidents where that caused bodily harm. Yeah, like you said, like the good way to point it out. Way on the IT side, if you have a compromise, you often lose a database, you lose credit cards. There's a lot of insurance with that, so nobody really gets hurt on that side. But on the OT side, depending on what happens, you can have systems that break down, stop. You can have temperature that rises up. You can have boilers that might explode, or some other way you can have environmental or even bodily harm to your employees.
That's scary.
Human safety, human life is
Yes.
always number one when it comes to IT security. Especially in the OT world, receives it a lot more. A lot of the IT world can like flee away from it. Like we aren't going to use gas that kills people when they go to the server room anymore. We won't do things like that. But OT really just can't avoid a lot of that impact that comes with it.
Yep. And to take out the fear factor, creating a situation where this happens is extremely difficult, but it is possible, right? And a well-designed controls environment has layers and layers of safety measures on there, and sometimes even just the design of the process doesn't allow for things to blow up. But in an ideal situation, I'm saying ideal for the attacker, things could go really wrong, and it has gone for some people.
Yeah, like Colonial Pipeline, for example.
I don't think anybody got harmed on that one. They were quick enough to shut everything down before anything really catastrophic.
Right. I'm just saying, yeah, the consequences of Colonial Pipeline were extreme to the point where it affected, gas prices even.
That's funny. That's funny that you say, because I saw pictures of people putting gas in plastic bags and then putting those in the bag. Like, if they would have been smoking over there, or those blew up, is that indirectly causing human harm?
Yeah, I think so.
That sounds like a terrible idea.
It's not a good
it happened. It happened out there. It's just like, wow, okay.
Yeah, just like a general note for everyone: don't put gasoline in Tupperware containers or plastic bags. It's not good.
That's what we've come here to talk about today. How you transport your gas. No, but in all seriousness, so it looks like the initial attack vector for Colonial Pipeline was compromised password. Let's discuss that a little bit. What do you think was the situation that happened there?
So I read up on this because I was wondering what they meant with compromised password. So it turned out that they reused a password, and they're not sure how these attackers got the username attached to that password yet. But so they reused a password, and it was actually a pretty secure password, but they used it on a website that got compromised, and their credentials were leaked. And if you go out and you do some research on like Combo 2020, 2021, those are giant 100+ gigabyte dumps of credentials that you can just download for free, or sometimes for a little payment off the regular web or the dark web or wherever you find those. But they're big sets of credentials with username, passwords that these attackers can use, and oftentimes you can tell by the username where they use them. So I'm suspecting that something like that happened. They came across these credentials, they came across the exposed VPN, they put one and one together, and they got into the network that way.
Yeah, and lack of no MFA, no 2FA, which is really the main way to stop credential stuffing and be able to avoid these kinds of attacks, wasn't used. And no MFA, no 2FA will always result in a situation where leaked credentials are reused. It's just the way of the world at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And depending how multi-factor authentication is implemented, that's still not the holy grail, but it makes it a lot more difficult, I believe. Except if you're using text messages, that's still an antiquated way of doing it. But some of the other ways, like your tokens and your apps, are a really sophisticated or really good way to do two-factor authentication.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and I apologize. I just wanted to say we did launch a poll. Does your organization have MFA enabled? And if so, what is it based on? So feel free to vote in that poll. And I apologize, Matt, what were you about to say?
Yeah, I was just going to say, and also make sure that you're training your employees to look out for unexpected pushes, unexpected requests for 2FA, and don't process them, especially in the case of like push notifications. Usually in those situations like Duo, they're going to have like a fraud button or like I didn't do this. Make sure that you're training your employees to utilize those, because then you can do detections on those. You can have a process associated with that, other than just what the common person will do is just say like, no, just deny and move on with their life. But if it was a real surprise, you and your organization really want to know, like, this was likely fraud. We want to follow up on this and why this is happening. And then it gives you that loop to build into your process, then, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. So I'll share the results of, the poll. Looks like the majority of our attendees do use MFA based on an app, which is great. A lot, though, are still using text messages for MFA, which, as you mentioned, can be a little outdated and insecure. And then a small percentage does not have MFA enabled, which is never necessarily a good thing. So, feel free to contact us if you need any help with implementing MFA or ask any questions about how to get that started in your organization.
Yeah, you always start from somewhere. So all you got to do is move forward.
Yep, and still, we're dissing on text message, but it's still better than not having anything in place. Again, it comes down to how badly do these attackers want to get into your environment? How much resources do they want to stick into this to compromise you?
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's a variety of ways that ransomware can be infiltrated in your environment. Let's talk about the ransomware kill chain. What are some of the steps that we see that are leading up to a ransomware attack?
And there's a number of solutions. Like MITRE has a really good kind of initial exploitation, initial access column associated with this, and we'll talk about a little bit more as we get into this. But really, ransomware, and this goes for every kind of attack, but really for ransomware is the most interesting one because the impact is so visible and high. That there always has to be an initial access point. There always has to be a way for those people to get into your environment. And in we'll say the old world of IT and IT security, a lot of the focus was on phishing. A lot of the focus was on users. A lot of focus was on how are users kind of destroying my environment, which is understandable to an extent. But really what we see now is there's still a focus on phishing to an extent, but the focus for a lot of ransomware tends to be more on exposed services, exposed attack surface, an attack surface that they can exploit and get into and have a reach into as they get into it. Of course, that phishing initial access still works well. Macros still work amazingly well against a lot of people. I can't get almost anyone to do this, but by all means, please just disable macros in your entire environment. If you can convince your business to do this, you will immediately protect a large portion of your environment. However, it is difficult to do and convince people to, which then brings us to visibility on that initial access. If you can get visibility into that initial access, kind of what Pascal was talking about previously, you can see what's happening. You can see that it's starting in your environment, generally speaking. If you got that, let's say, fraud notification from that 2FA, you would know that someone was trying to credential stuff, which is to say using stolen credentials with that account. If you were monitoring Apache web shells, you would know that someone was attempting to exploit one of your DMZ web servers. If you were monitoring, let's say, password spraying at your VPN, you might see that someone is attempting to get into a VPN to move forward. There are a number of areas, or you could be monitoring PowerShell transcription, we'll say, across all your hosts to determine if someone is trying to get to that initial access. There are a number of components that are associated with initial access.
One that I want to add in there while you're seeing initial access, I would say monitoring your DNS records, your DNS request is a fantastic way to discover some of this stuff, right? Not only just lookups of DNS queries, but also weird DNS queries where you have long strings of random numbers and letters, which could be exfiltration. So DNS is one of the first things I always start monitoring.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that initial access has to have connection out. And in most cases, those C2s, moving into that next stage, those C2s are going to be based off somewhere weird that a normal human would look at and say, that's odd. Very few attackers have bought like friendlypeople.com. It's usually like free download 24/7.uk and then an insane subdomain so they can identify you as the actual victim associated with it. And if you look at like SolarWinds, which is obviously not ransomware, you can see the complexity that goes into these C2s as they're built out, so command and control services they're built out. And DNS is a super good way, definitely, to look at those lookups and say, what are people actually looking for? What data is being passed? What's the size of the lookup? If they're starting to do DNS exfiltration or DNS data passing, can definitely be super, super useful across every environment.
And then the next one, escalate privileges. In your opinion, is this kind of the point of no return almost? Like if you are the victim of a ransomware attack and the threat actor gets to this point, is there anything that you can do to really mitigate the attack itself?
There is, yeah, and these days, like over the last 2 weeks, persistent and like escalating privileges is easier than it ever has been between the Hive nightmare, the SAM, exposed SAM files, the print spooler, local escalation, and remote code execution. Escalating privileges on Microsoft is easier than it ever has been, is probably the best way to put that. And honestly, some of these older OT servers are probably safer than some of these newer Windows servers, like we're seeing with these Hive nightmare issues. But once someone escalates privileges, it really is more a question of what cached credentials are on that host and where can they go with them. When the moment that someone escalates privileges or is vulnerable to the Hive nightmare stuff that people are seeing discussed, the moment that happens, any cached credentials can be pulled from that host if it's a Windows host. And usually what we see at that point, and usually what these advanced ransomware teams are doing at that point, is looking for domain admin credentials, looking for as high as credentials they can find across these machines. So they'll either escalate and then dump creds and move laterally to wherever they can, looking for better credentials, or they will be able to get what they need at that point and then spread wide across every machine because they were able to identify those domain admin credentials. And that's really just a matter of, let's say they land on server A, and 3 days ago, domain admin A also logged into that. That credential is likely still sitting on that server from when they logged in, cached, unless you've changed the settings or it's been actively used over that time period. And that's really where escalating privileges can become really dangerous for organizations. So you can still get rid of it, but it means your life's going to get harder at that point.
Yeah, and you have to move quickly at that point. Pascal, we mentioned Windows. In your experience, are OT environments running Windows as their OS? Are they using Linux? What's the majority of OSs in these OT environments?
So mostly Windows systems and mostly the Windows 7 and early Windows 10 versions that they encounter there.
Okay.
If you do encounter domain setups like a Microsoft Active Directory domain, it's going to be a 2016, sometimes even before that, 2008, I think it was before that. So that's mostly there. What's frustrating sometimes is that they're not properly configured, and most people will have like a domain admin account to run everything on there, which is really bad idea, because as soon as you have one piece of malware, you don't even have to do escalation of privileges. You're already the domain admin, and it spreads throughout the entire environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It seems like there are steps that there obviously are steps that you can take to prevent a ransomware event in the first place, but having that incident response plan it seems like it's so crucial in making sure that the event, once that does happen, is mitigated as much as humanly possible. Alondra, Paul, I'm curious as to whether our attendees have an incident response plan in place, or whether they're still evaluating that and figuring out how to do that. Let's talk about the incident response lifecycle. This is based off of the NIST framework, right, Matt?
Yes, yeah. Yes, it's pretty well accepted across the environment. And in many ways, IR is just this nonstop process that we're all kind of going through within our organizations. And inherently, for many organizations, it's easy to feel so busy that you don't have time to sit down and think about this process. But it's really important to not only think about your attack surface, but also think about your attack surface and model it against your incident response process as it pertains to the life cycle. And that's really where you talk about that first step preparation. Where are we as an organization? Where are we at in regard to what our attack surface is? How are we looking? Have we modeled these things out? Because you can't get into detection and analysis unless you've thought about what do we need to monitor, what's going on in our environment, what's our actual surface that someone might want to attack. So these all kind of lead into each other, of course. And as you move through detection and analysis, which I'm sure differs in the world of OT versus IT. And OT, you're going to be doing even more broad detection analysis, how people are interacting with PLCs, that kind of thing. Whereas in the IT world, you're less focused on those kind of actions as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and Pascal, in the OT space, what are the differences in the incident response life cycle, if any?
So the life cycle itself is pretty much the same. It's implementation of the phases.
Mhm.
And preparation is going to be preparation, right? You want to be prepared. You want to, in the first place, you want to know that this is in place, that you have an incident response plan, and that it's up to date and all that stuff. But once you get to the point where you have to implement it, you have an incident. That's when things get a little different. A lot of these production facilities, they're 24/7. They have to run all the time. You cannot go in and just shut down a machine because it's infected. Actually, I've been in plants where they said, okay, we know it's infected, but we got to finish this batch, because if we don't, we're going to have a big mess, and we have 2 or 3 weeks of cleanup time on that. So you keep running as much as you can. It be limped. You do other preventive measures around the incident to just keep running. So that's the big difference. And it's also oftentimes some of the phases, and I think we're going to go into details on these phases, but some of the phases are just differently implemented because you're dealing with production systems, because your uptime and your availability is your first and most important measure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned production. I think that was what happened with Colonial Pipeline too, right? Is that they knew there was a ransomware attack, but there's not much you can do at that point if you have a production line that a lot of the nation relies on for such an important product, right?
Yeah, that must have been the most difficult decision to make ever, to shut that down, because that is not a small undertaking. At that point, they were partially or mostly blind as well. So they had to fly out people, they had to drive out, they had to go out in the middle of nowhere to shut some of these systems down. So making a decision, that wasn't taken lightheartedly.
Right. And an incident response plan should ideally help you to make those decisions, right?
Yep.
So let's go into the steps that you can take to create an incident response plan, both on the IT side and on the OT side, so you have as much coverage as possible. For preparation, that's kind of step 0 here. Matt, do you want to talk to the IT side a bit and what you should be doing at this step in the incident response practice?
Sure, yeah. And a lot of this is focused around what we recommend to get you the best visibility for what's there in your environment. So focusing on getting that advanced EDR type data, we recommend using Sysmon. If you use CrowdStrike, if you use Carbon Black Defense, if you use any sort of EDR type solution, that's going to get you that data. And really what we're looking for is really granular actions against that host that Windows just doesn't log out by default. It's a good example in regard to like going back to what we've seen coming out, the Hive Nightmare issue. That kind of action that you've seen associated with the privilege escalation for the exposed SAM files is not logged in Windows. There is 0 logging associated with that in Windows by default. It is impossible to identify that being executed against an environment. So making sure that you get some more visibility like Sysmon in these machines is really important. And of course, just generally collecting your Windows event logs. Getting Sysmon in there is important, just as important as getting logs out in general. Making sure that you have reports and visibility in your environment that is important. And this goes to that, knowing your attack surface, knowing what's important to you, and understanding your environment. If you don't know where your potential holes are or where they're coming from, or you don't have a way to review that data, you will have a difficult time of being able to figure out, are you properly defending your environment, or can you properly defend your environment? And if you can't, that IR process is going to become much more difficult as you get into it if there's a proper attack.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And you mentioned the importance of Sysmon, how important it is to enable that. We have a wonderful guide on Sysmon that Amanda Berlin, she's on our security team. She wrote a really comprehensive guide on configuring Sysmon that's really helpful. So I put that in the chat. Feel free to check that out if you have any questions about how to get Sysmon into your environment. Those really rich Windows logs can be so crucial to maintaining visibility. And it's helpful on the OT side as well, right, Pascal?
Yep. As a matter of fact, everything Matt just talked about applies to the OT side. Where we differ a little bit is the the sources
Mm.
of the event logs. We're going a little bit deeper. Oftentimes, companies will invest in an OT specific IDS, intrusion detection system. So we want to make sure that we capture those logs along with everything else, so we can set up a timeline. We can do some correlation and stuff like that. Maybe I should back up a little bit. For the first foremost step in preparation is knowing your environment, like Matt said as well. It's especially important in the OT side because from a high level, OT environments are very protectable because they're very stagnant. They're solid. You set them up, they have an X amount of hosts, and that doesn't change almost ever. So if you know what's in there, what you expect to communicate, and all of a sudden you have something new, that's a fantastic indicator that something fishy is going on, right? That at a minimum, somebody's trying to plug into your network. That's not allowed. So knowing what you have, asset management helps with that. Is the first key step, and then getting these logs out of your devices. And oftentimes the device you don't think about. Because I'm a Rockwell guy in a previous life, having your Factory Talk suite send events up to your IDS or up to your SIM is very valuable. Factory Talk event logging, it shows you everything that goes on in your in the Factory Talk directory. So people logging in, people making changes, who's doing what where, and then you can start correlating that with shifts and stuff like that. For example, if somebody makes a PLC change at 4 p.m. And this person is supposed to be on shift, that's normal. But if the same person makes that change at midnight or 1 a.m. and then they're supposed to be off, that should raise a flag.
Yeah, absolutely. And then with the next step, detection analysis, those logs come in handy as well. Let's talk about that step.
Yeah, and that's of course where Boomera is excited to kind of be that pivot point for everyone, where we're making sure we're pulling that data in, coming up with crazy ways with Pascal to pull data out of OT environments, which is a much longer probably discussion. And making sure that you are able to get what you need out of your detection point of view, consider it with your attack surface, validate that, and then be able to kind of push through and move into your next stages, or be able to say this isn't something that's relevant to an attack to us. We can move on and move to the next kind of process associated with whatever's going on in our environment. Initial access is, of course, kind of where we were talking before. You want to try to focus your detection and analysis up that defense in depth, because you want to try to get ahead of it as much as you can, because you want to get those layers as tight as you can up, moving to where your attack surface is, where initial access is, where people are moving into persistence, and less in someone's exfiltrating all my data and encrypting everything. What are we doing now? That's a bad place for anyone to be in the IT/OT world, where you're just kind of like, well, it's happening. Now what do we do? And you always want to move that up as much as possible. And as you can kind of see from these two examples, like I dropped one in there. We started using more MITRE TTP tagging. So you're seeing that on that one, where focusing on how your environment is structured is really important. And I think we're probably going to talk about this a little bit in the next few minutes, but making sure that your IT and OT environments are segmented and not going to just open up your OT environment because of an IT issue, and ensuring that you are able to properly kind of handle and analyze what's going on in your environment is really, really important. And that could be monitoring your DMZ, it could be monitoring lateral movement, it could be monitoring just credential use in your environment as well. There are a few different kind of steps that go with that, which if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to go through. But really, it's kind of exactly what we've been harping on, which is to say, know your environment, know your attack surface, and then build your detections or understand your detections in a way that they will look for attacks relevant to that environment, which is, it's really kind of the most important step within the detection framework.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, the importance of segmenting your OT and IT environments. Pascal, earlier you were talking about how, that presents an opportunity for threat actors to pivot from IT to OT. Talk a little bit about what that looks like in practice.
So I'm going to oversimplify this, but if you properly segment your IT from your OT environments, and we have some articles on our website that can help you understand the mechanisms and the methodology behind it. But if you manage to properly segment those, you could actually get to the point where you say, okay, my IT environment is on fire. I'm gonna shut down the link between IT and OT, and you can continue production. So the many things that Colonial did right in incident response, I think they should not have been in that situation. They should have had a properly segmented environment where they could comfortably say, okay, we're gonna pull the plug, we're gonna shut down our DMZ, we're gonna do whatever it takes to take down that link, and we feel secure enough to do that. Now that's overly simplifying because getting there is a lot of work, but that's typically the aim you want to have for setting up OT security. So you want a completely segmented network with just a single link between IT and OT that you can scrutinize the inter communication between the two.
Mm-hmm. And does that make the next step of incident response containment easier when you do have a segmented environments like what you're talking about?
From a high level, yes. Well, from a high level, first of all, you can segment IT and OT at first place. But let's say that it did get into your OT space. If you implemented what we call micro-segmenting, so you're not just having one flat network that's OT, but you also have a network that's for your boilers. You have a network segment that's for production line 1. You have a network segment that's for production line 2. And then you put proper firewall rules or ACLs between those. Now you have the chance to shut down one of those micro segments as well. Again, containing the incident within those micro segments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the segmentation is something that I think all of us on the IT security world will always ask for more of. And everyone in the IT system world will, for good reason, say, please stop asking us to do this, we're exhausted. And I get it.
But you're losing. It's a losing battle on the IT side with bring your own devices, with cloud services. It is going to be more and more difficult to do that, and therefore I feel myself lucky that we're protecting OT. That's why I keep saying OT is by nature is very defendable. There's many more reasons, but we can still segment it. We know what should traverse on there. It's confined to a certain amount, a finite amount of traffic, so we can somewhat easily start monitoring for bad behavior.
Yeah, and it makes lateral movement detection so much easier when you have those deep segmentations. And you can say,
why is this PLC always been communicating with that PLC, and all of a sudden it's going to go to something else, right?
Exactly.
It's easy to detect that. That's really difficult to detect on the IT side.
Yes, yeah, for sure, yeah.
I just shared in the chat, by the way, the articles that Pascal was referring to about designing security and how proper architecture matters when it comes to ICS, and some tips on how to segment your environments. So
see, it pays off to have your mom on the call.
Is Clint your mom? You didn't tell me about that.
That's a different discussion.
I always had a feeling about that. Yeah, there's some relationship going. Oh, dad. Okay.
Oh, daddy. I got daddy issues.
Oh man. So let's discuss a little bit about the next step in an incident response plan: recovery and eradication, which are kind of meshed into one another, right? What's the relationship between those two steps?
I'm happy to take it. So I mean, yeah, the preservation for evidence is a really strange beast in the IT world, and I think anyone who's dealt with IR in the IT world, I'd be interested in the OT side, has probably experienced this, where recovery of IT becomes way more important than maintaining evidence, realistically, for 80% of companies. Not all of them. Ones that are essential for cyber insurance payouts, they'll preserve some amount of data. Someone who's decided to reach out to the FBI, which is a rare thing, but if they decide to reach out to the FBI, happens more with ransomware, they might preserve some amount of evidence. Usually in that case, it's more of a situation like with Bluemira, where it's like, can you pull the log files? Because we're about to destroy everything inside of here, and we need to get this data out to the FBI or to DHS or someone like that. It is, however, really important to ensure that if you haven't shipped those logs, if you haven't shipped data, that you don't just tear down the thing that was either the impact of the infection or has associated with your infection. If you have cyber insurance, which if you do, I'm sure you've seen your rates going up. So it's always good to think about how you're defending your environment and not wanting to really engage with cyber insurance. It's important for that kind of thing. You want to make sure, if you are just touching on cyber insurance more, if you are someone who has cyber insurance, read the fine details of what you need to get that payout. It usually requires a good set of things that you want to make sure you hit on. And then, of course, moving into rebuilding, restoring, getting backups up going, resetting any user credentials, which is a much longer problem if you start thinking about golden tickets being stolen out of AD. There are situations where you resetting your user credentials is almost impossible without rebuilding your Active Directory environment. And then, of course, kind of where are you at, where you're going, how can you have a secure, how can you then bring your environment back to being secure and be fully eradicated, which is, of course, the big question when you're moving out of an incident, which is to say, have we recovered our full environment? Are we safe now? Have we plugged the hole? And are we moving forward securely?
Right. And it seems like backups are such a key component of recovering. It makes it so much easier if you do have backups.
Yeah, not just trusted backups, but the second question, do you test your
exactly,
backups?
yeah. So I did just launch a poll, curious to see how everyone responds to that. Pascal, what role do backups play in the OT space? Is it just as important?
So for all of these, the same message that Matt just presented counts for the OT side as well. But then we, on top of that, to escalate things, to make things more difficult, we have to work around the production schedule, right? Remember, we still want to get the product out the door, so all of these things need to happen as well. It's hit or miss in the OT side. We'll find customers that have backups, that have spares for their servers, so we can actually basically go in and basically put a whole new server rack in, restore the VMs or restore the operating system, and we'll be running in no time. And then on the other end, there's customers that have no backups, no spares, and you have to go in and you have to go to a Best Buy, get new hard drives, install the hard drives, get the operating system, and mind you, that's Windows XP or Windows 7 at that point, install those, get the right version of the control systems, and hopefully they have a backup of the actual control logic programs, but otherwise you have to work with the vendors that they had back in the 90s, the early 2000s that created those. You got to install those, so and then all of that to get production back up and running. So yeah.
So excuse my ignorance here, but can you just go to a Best Buy and get a computer that is running Windows 7?
I've taken over certain HMIs with Raspberry Pis, anything to get production running again, right?
Okay.
If you want to do this long term, you want to professionally install your server rack, you want to professionally do it. But once you're there and you need to get production back up and running because you're losing $1,000 a minute, you'll do anything to get going again. So yeah, and I can't stress enough, if you're not doing backups, start doing them now. And if you're doing backups, test them and don't store them on top of the microwave.
Yeah.
Well, the good news is it looks like 100% of our attendees do have a backup plan. So that's great to hear. And then 75% test the backups. So
it's pretty good.
Yeah, seems like it. But, if you're not testing your backups, feel free to contact us and, let us know if you have any challenges or roadblocks that are preventing you from testing your backups. We'll see how we can help with that. Yeah. So then with post-incident response, there's always post-incident activities as well. So it's kind of going back to the beginning of the cycle here, right? You start monitoring and making sure that you're preventing incidents, so you don't have to go through this whole process again, right?
Yep. Oftentimes you'll take indicators of compromise at this point and make sure that you're not getting reinfected. So you get your lessons learned, you look at your logs, you keep extra good care of it because, well, production is probably going to be rushed up back into, you're probably going to be rushed back into production again. So you want to make sure that you didn't forget anything. People in the middle of the night didn't accidentally put a backup on there that was infected as well. So this is very important that you keep your eyes on the environment for a while until you're completely confident that stuff doesn't happen. Even then, I often recommend that once you're in production for an X amount of time, you do like a threat hunt, you do a breach assessment just to follow up to make sure that everything was taken out of the environment.
Absolutely. And it seems like the monitoring for suspicious activity that, Blumera can obviously help with that. And it's the early stage activities, the early like suspicious behaviors that you really want to look for, right, Matt?
It's those are the ones that you want to look for sure. In a situation where kind of like Pascal was saying, where you've gone through the process, you were able to eradicate it. If you're able to eradicate it, it means you probably know how it worked, or at least have a general idea as it works. So you can start to look at potentially monitor for every stage of how that attack actually works. In the worst case, however, of course, you think that you've solved it and you get an alert that says someone exfiltrated like 100 gigs of data, and then you have a real bad day. But that kind of just goes with making sure that you're monitoring and then reinserting what lessons learned from the actual attack. And that goes to kind of root cause analysis, determining how that attack actually happened, determining how it grew to the point that it did, if it did. And what I always recommend doing, and we do this here at Blumera, is anytime anything happens that could be resulting in some sort of threat, it's worth sitting down and going through the IR process and doing like a root cause analysis for that. And it could just be a phishing email, but it's good practice for IT. It's good practice for IT security to sit down and say, here's what happened, here's where it's going, here's what could have happened, here are the IOCs we pulled out, and here's the information we can use to follow up on this. And that's okay if it only takes an hour or two to throw that out and you were able to get some data out of it. But what it really does is it trains you for when it happens, big time when it happens, you can sit down and say, here's what we learned from it, here's how we eradicated, here's the data we learned. We're going to talk to our MSP, we're going to talk to Blumera, we're going to talk to whoever, and we're going to work on using the information that we gathered and they gathered to build back into detections and be able to analyze this data on the fly. Because it's a lot of it's initial access, a lot of it is kind of seeing how that attack flowed, which is to say, like, if the attacker used Mimikatz to dump creds, we want to know that we can see Mimikatz across every host. But that doesn't change the fact that you want to make sure that you kind of have every stack covered across your environment. And that should also be part of those lesson learned, which is to say, did we have a hole somewhere? Yes. Where can we fill that hole?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. And the great thing about Blumera is that we have so many built-in detections that are actively finding these threats for you, like Mimikatz, Cobalt Strike, all of the things that are indicators of compromise and will indicate a ransomware attack. Pascal, do you want to talk about how ThreatGen specifically finds those indicators of compromise as well on the OT side?
Yeah, let me circle around. So on this slide, if you look at the first 3 steps of this chain, that's if you can detect something malicious going on in one of those 3 steps, that's what we call preventing this from happening, right? If we can get to that, but once we're compromised and we're back up and running, we want to keep an eye on all of these steps. If anything weird goes on in any of these steps that we pick up, then we didn't do a good job in IR response. And a tool like Blumera is a fantastic tool to help with this. And mainly because, and now we're going to tie back to what ThreatGen has to offer in this space, mainly because right now, not right now, but mainly in the OT space, we had a lot of islands of data where we had an IDS, we had FactoryTalk directory events, we had Windows domain or Windows event logs, and they were all separate. But a lot of these attacks, they cover a variety of those systems. So having a way to get that data into a SIM, a correlation platform like Blumera, is just the next evolution step of doing your security monitoring on the OT side. And that's where ThreatGen comes in. We know how to deploy the individual systems. We know how to set up an Active Directory on the OT side. We know how to deploy an OT specific IDS. We know how to get Sysmon installed. We know how to get all of that stuff correlated and shipped off to the cloud without compromising the integrity of your system, meaning that we'll send just enough information for the Blumera correlation platform to make its decision, but not enough for somebody that could intercept some of these messages to see any compromising data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. So, we're talking about how, those first three steps that we mentioned are so important in detecting those. And that's where Blumera comes in with all of those steps, but also with detecting and responding early in the stages of a ransomware attack. That's really where you want to focus your efforts. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to be at the point where everything is encrypted, or is being encrypted, where things are just basically things slowly stop working, or you slowly can't access more files, and until someone realizes like, hey, something weird is going on, or like what I also recommend is detecting on when a single user is opening file handlers for a number of different files, which Sysmon can do for you. Those kind of patterns can give you the visibility into like the my world is changing, but you don't want to be at that point. You want to be at kind of exactly what Pascal was talking about. You want to be at those first three. You want to see initial access. You want to see that someone is trying to get to persistence. You want to see that someone's trying to escalate. You don't want to see that someone has accessed 50,000 files in the last 10 minutes. It won't be better for you at that point. You could, I mean, it's not a bad thing. You can shut everything off and you might be able to save some files, but in the OT world, you're not going to be able to shut everything off to save some files. And in the IT world, I think you're going to be hard to get sign off to just kill things in many cases. So always moving up that kind of thought process around what are we exposing? Where could someone get in? How is my environment built? How can we ensure those first three steps can have some amount of detection, visibility, analysis, and ensuring that we can react when things happen within the environment. It's really, really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is an example of a security finding that you'll see on the Blumera platform. Matt, can you talk a little bit about what that looks like from a customer perspective?
Sure, yeah. So generally speaking, Blumera approaches detection, we call them findings, in a few different ways. We want people to have a concept of the type and priority, which is to say, in this case, this is a threat, but we also use the concept of suspects, which is to say, is this action something that should be happening in your environment, like a domain name being created or a mailbox forwarding rule being added to Office 365? In many cases, those are purposeful, but if they aren't purposeful, your world changes pretty fast and you need to take action. Ensuring that there are proper playbooks associated with every detection is also really big for us, and making sure you have a concept of case management. Who's in charge of this in your environment? Who's working it? Having a place to talk about it, having a place to upload any sort of attachments associated with it, and be able to talk to the Blumera SecOps team in the case of any sort of questions or issues associated with the detections at hand, which I know we've done a lot of work over the last number of months with Pascal, working with Forstep, for example, and pushing forward on detections for there. Because we want to make sure this is as robust as possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really strong point for the Blumera solution, is that it shows you initial steps to take. Right, you can start right away. You can start implementing some mitigation steps. So that's a fantastic little feature.
Yeah, and we're real security experts, so you can talk to a security team right then and there. It's basically be an extension of your security team, which is so important for understaffed or smaller IT teams that are struggling with resources. So really a huge value add for those customers. And if you are thinking about trying out Blumera, feel free to download our free trial. It's extremely easy to deploy. I think a lot of our customers have been able to completely implement their free trial in even less than 30 minutes, which is pretty exciting for a SIM to have that, ease of deployment there. And ask any questions if you want to get in touch with us at Blumera. Matt's always available for questions and concerns, and we're happy to chat and see, what your challenges are when it comes to security and how we can help. And Pascal, talk a little bit about, this breach assessment. What is this offering that ThreatGen has?
So this is basically our initial offering into further negotiations or discussions with customers. Just if you're curious to the state of your security environment, if anything breached your perimeter, then contact us and I will get with you to do a breach assessment where we collect a little bit of data, we collect some logs, and we start looking into it and can tell you what's going on and if you should be worried or not.
Excellent. Well, you two have been so helpful, have taught me a lot during this hour. So thank you so much for joining. Matt, thank you so much. And Pascal, we really appreciate your participation, and it was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you,
Excellent.
everyone.
Thank you for all the attendees that joined.